She didn't disappear. She was erased. For 2 years, the world believed she had moved on, changed cities, changed her life, maybe even changed her name. But behind locked doors, in a place with no windows and no witnesses, she was still counting days by scratches on a wall. All because one man was afraid. And one woman wanted her gone. This isn't just a story about imprisonment. It's about betrayal wearing the mask of love. About how trust can become a weapon. And about what happens when someone underestimates the quiet strength of a person they think they've already broken. Because here's the truth no one talks about. The most dangerous moment isn't when someone is trapped. It's the day they're finally released. And when that day came for her, it wasn't freedom she planned first. It was reckoning. So ask yourself, if everything was taken from you, what would you do with the truth once you got it back? Before she vanished, her life looked ordinary enough that no one thought to worry. She had routines, morning coffee prepared the same way, messages answered at predictable hours, weekends divided between errands and quiet rest. The kind of life that doesn't raise alarms when it suddenly goes silent. When people later tried to retrace her steps, they realized how easy it is for a person to disappear when the world assumes everything is fine. No dramatic goodbye, no final argument witnessed in public. Just a slow, almost polite fading from view. And that's what made it so dangerous. Nothing felt urgent enough to question. Those closest to her noticed small things first. Messages left unseen, but never answered. Missed calls explained away by excuses that didn't quite sound like her. She was busy, apparently. Needed space. Phrases that sound reasonable until they don't. Friends assumed distance. Family assumed stress. Everyone assumed she would reappear when she was ready. And meanwhile, the silence grew heavier, stretching from days into weeks. The truth was far more deliberate than anyone imagined. This wasn't a decision to leave. It was a decision made for her. What no one knew was that her world had already begun shrinking. Not all disappearances happen with violence or chaos. Some happen quietly, behind closed doors, disguised as protection, concern, or love. The first restrictions didn't feel like imprisonment. They felt like compromise, then boundaries blurred. Access narrowed. Choices disappeared one by one. And by the time the door finally locked literally and figuratively, there was no audience left to witness it. That's the cruel trick of control. It isolates you so thoroughly that when something goes wrong, there's no one left to notice. Years later, investigators would ask the same question again and again. How could someone vanish for so long without anyone realizing what was happening? The answer was uncomfortable. Because the signs were there, but they were quiet. Because trust is often given to the wrong people. And because the person responsible never looked like a villain, at least not at first. Chapter 1 of this story doesn't end with a scream or a struggle. It ends with a closed door. And a woman the world believed had simply walked away. At the center of it all was a relationship that, from the outside, looked stable, maybe imperfect, but familiar. They had history. Shared memories. The kind of bond that convinces people they already know how the story ends. But beneath the surface, something has shifted. Conversations became guarded. Affection turned conditional. Love, once freely given, started to feel like something she had to earn. And when trust begins to feel like work, it's often because someone else has quietly entered the equation. The other woman didn't arrive with chaos. She arrived with whispers. Late-night messages explained away as work. Sudden changes in behavior framed as stress. She wasn't introduced as a threat, she was invisible at first. But invisibility can be powerful. It allows lies to grow without friction. And slowly, the narrative changed. The woman who would later be imprisoned was no longer the partner, she was the problem. Too emotional. Too suspicious. Too difficult. It's a familiar tactic. Rewrite reality until the victim starts questioning their own instincts. What made this betrayal especially cruel was how it was justified. He spoke of loyalty while practicing deception. He spoke of love while planning control. And the mistress, far from being a passive presence, fed the paranoia, reinforcing the idea that this woman was a risk, a liability. Someone who might ruin everything if left unchecked. In private conversations, fear became strategy. And strategy became resolve. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a decision built over time, brick by brick. By the time she sensed something was deeply wrong, the ground beneath her had already shifted. The man she trusted no longer saw her as a partner, but as an obstacle. And the woman in the shadows no longer saw her as human but as disposable. Love didn't collapse all at once. It was dismantled quietly, replaced by lies that sounded logical enough to excuse the unthinkable. And with that final emotional separation complete, the next step became possible. Because once someone is no longer seen as a person, controlling them feels justified. The moment everything crossed the line didn't arrive with shouting or sudden violence. It arrived quietly, almost politely. A suggestion that she stay inside for a while. A reason that sounded reasonable. The outside world, he said, was complicated, dangerous, full of people who didn't have her best interests at heart. And because trust had already been bent and reshaped, she listened. That's how the first door closed, not with a slam, but with reassurance. The kind that makes you feel foolish for questioning it. At first, nothing looked like imprisonment. She still moved around the house, still spoke to him, still believed this was temporary, but rules began to appear. Who she could talk to, when she could use her phone. Which questions were unnecessary. Each rule alone felt small. Together they formed a cage. And when she pushed back even gently, the response wasn't anger, it was disappointment. As if she were the one breaking trust. That reversal was deliberate. Confusion is easier to control than fear. The first truly locked door came later. A moment so ordinary it almost didn't register. A click, a pause. The realization that she couldn't leave when she wanted to. He framed it as protection. As a precaution. Just for now. But time behaves differently when your freedom depends on someone else's mood. Minutes stretch. Hours echo. And suddenly, the walls feel closer than they did the day before. That's when the truth finally surfaced, not spoken, but understood. This wasn't care. This was control. She thought about screaming, about resisting. But fear doesn't always arrive loud, it often arrives practical. What happens if this gets worse? What if no one believes me? So she waited. She observed. She adapted. Because survival, in those early days, meant learning the rules of a game she never agreed to play. And as the doors stayed locked longer, one thing became clear. This wasn't a mistake that would be corrected. It was a system being put in place. And once systems settle in, they don't dismantle easily. Days inside confinement don't pass, they blur. Without markers like schedules, sunlight, or choice, time becomes something you feel instead of measure. At first, she tried counting. Hours, meals, footsteps outside the door. But the numbers stopped helping. They only reminded her of how little control she had. The room itself became her entire world, its sounds, its shadows, its silence, and the most unsettling part wasn't the loneliness. It was how quickly the mind begins to adapt when it has no alternative. Psychological control replaced physical force. He didn't need chains when doubt worked better. Some days he was calm, even kind, as if nothing unusual was happening. Other days, cold and distant. The unpredictability was intentional. It kept her alert, constantly recalculating her behavior. Was this a good day or a dangerous one? That uncertainty erodes resistance faster than violence ever could. She learned when to speak, when to stay quiet, when to disappear into herself. Survival became a performance. She replayed memories to stay grounded. Familiar voices. Places she used to walk. Small details the mind clings to when reality becomes unbearable. But even memory can turn against you. Doubt seeps in. Would anyone even recognize me now? Would they believe this happened? Isolation doesn't just remove people, it alters perception. It makes the impossible feel permanent. And permanence is the real prison. Once you believe nothing will change, hope becomes dangerous. Yet somewhere beneath the fear, something else remained. Quiet, patient, watching. She began noticing patterns, times he was careless, moments when routines slipped. She didn't act on them, not yet. Because inside that cage, impulsiveness meant punishment. Strategy meant survival. This chapter of her life wasn't about escape. It was about endurance. About staying alive long enough to matter again. And without realizing it, while they believed she was breaking, she was learning. From the outside, he didn't look like a monster. That was part of the danger. He appeared composed, rational, someone who believed he was always the smartest person in the room. Control for him wasn't about rage, it was about order. He needed the world to behave predictably, to move according to his expectations. And when something or someone threatened that order, he didn't see it as cruelty to intervene. He saw it as correction. In his mind, what he was doing wasn't wrong. It was necessary. Power became his language. Not loud power, but quiet authority, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. He decided when conversations happened, when food was given, when silence was enforced. Each decision reinforced the same message: nothing moves without me. And the more control he exercised, the more convinced he became of his own superiority. This is how obsession hardens into certainty. He stopped questioning his actions because questioning would mean admitting he could be wrong. And that was something his ego couldn't survive. What he failed to understand was the difference between dominance and intelligence. He believed total control made him untouchable. That planning made him flawless. But obsession narrows vision. It creates blind spots. While he monitored her every move, he ignored the smallest details, the moments when routine slipped, when arrogance replaced caution. He underestimated her not because she was weak, but because believing otherwise would fracture the story he told himself. And once someone convinces themselves another person is powerless, they stop watching closely. This chapter isn't about excusing him. It's about understanding the fatal flaw that would eventually undo everything. Control demands constant vigilance. And the moment that vigilance relaxes even briefly, the illusion cracks. He believed the cage he built was permanent. That fear would do the work for him forever. What he didn't see was that endurance breeds observation. And observation over time becomes leverage. While he believed he controlled everything, the balance was already shifting. She was never meant to be visible. That was the plan. While he played the role of authority, the mistress operated in the margins, quiet, strategic, and patient. To the outside world, she barely existed. No public confrontations. No dramatic declarations. But behind the scenes, her influence was constant. She didn't need to give orders, she planted ideas. Subtle suggestions framed as concern. Questions that sounded harmless but carried intent. What if she tells someone? What if she ruins everything? Fear, once introduced, does the rest on its own. Unlike him, the mistress understood something crucial. Power doesn't always come from force, it often comes from proximity. She knew which insecurities to press, which doubts to amplify. When he hesitated, she reinforced his worst assumptions. When guilt surfaced, she reframed it as self-defense. Over time, her voice blended seamlessly with his own thoughts. That's how manipulation works best, not by command, but by alignment. He believed the decisions were his. That illusion made him more dangerous. What's chilling is how ordinary her role appeared. There was no constant cruelty, no overt villainy, just calculation. Just distance. To her, the woman in confinement wasn't a person with a life and history. She was an obstacle standing between desire and stability. And obstacles, in that mindset, aren't meant to be empathized with. They're meant to be removed. That emotional detachment made everything easier. Easier to justify. Easier to maintain. But detachment comes at a cost. When you stop seeing someone as human, you stop predicting them accurately. The mistress assumed fear would flatten resistance completely. That obedience would be permanent. What she didn't account for was patience, or memory, or the quiet intelligence of someone forced to observe for survival. From behind the curtain, she believed she was controlling the outcome. In reality, she was helping build the evidence that would later expose them. Both. Control creates confidence. Confidence creates carelessness. After months, then years of believing everything was contained, routines hardened into habits. The same times, the same movements, the same assumptions. He no longer double-checked every detail. The mistress no longer questioned whether fear was enough. They believed the system worked because it had worked for so long. That belief was the mistake. Because systems fail the moment they're trusted more than they're monitored. It wasn't a dramatic slip, no raised voices, no broken locks. Just a small inconsistency barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't paying attention, but she noticed. She had nothing else to notice. Patterns had become her calendar, her clock, her map. And when one of those patterns shifted by minutes, by carelessness, it registered immediately. She didn't react. She stored it. Information, she understood now, was more valuable than courage. The opportunity didn't arrive fully formed. It arrived in fragments, a moment alone, an unsecured object. A conversation overheard that wasn't meant for her ears. Each fragment alone meant nothing. Together, they formed possibility. And possibility, after so long without it, was dangerous. Not because it inspired reckless action, but because it had to be protected. One wrong move would confirm their worst fears and erase any chance of escape. So she waited. Again, what they never saw coming was how patient she had become. They mistook silence for submission, stillness for defeat. In reality, she was calculating risk with precision they didn't believe she possessed. The mistake wasn't leaving an opening. The mistake was assuming she wouldn't know what to do with it. And from that moment on, the balance tipped quietly, invisibly toward an ending they no longer controlled. Freedom didn't arrive the way she had imagined it would. There was no dramatic escape, no rush of adrenaline-filled triumph. When the door finally opened, it felt unreal, like stepping into a memory rather than a moment. Her body moved before her mind caught up. Muscles stiff from confinement hesitated, as if unsure whether this was permission or another test. Even then, part of her expected the door to close again. Because when captivity lasts long enough, release doesn't feel like relief. It feels like risk. The outside world was louder than she remembered. Brighter, faster, ordinary sounds, cars passing, people talking, a phone ringing felt overwhelming. She realized how much time had passed not by a calendar, but by change. Faces looked older. Technology felt unfamiliar. Life had continued without her, indifferent to what she'd endured. And that realization carried its own quiet pain. Survival had kept her alive, but it had also frozen her in place while the world moved on. Shock delayed emotion. She didn't cry right away. She didn't celebrate. Her mind stayed focused, alert, cataloging everything. Because freedom, she understood, was only the first step. What came next would determine whether what happened to her stayed hidden or finally came into the light. Every detail mattered now. Every conversation. Every memory she had preserved during those long, silent days. This wasn't about revenge, not yet. This was about truth. As the initial haze lifted, something solid replaced it, resolve. She knew they believed the story was over. That releasing her would end the danger, but they misunderstood the moment entirely. The cage had kept her quiet, but it had also given her time. Time to remember. Time to observe. Time to prepare. And as she stepped fully back into the world, one thing was clear. The door opening didn't end the story. It started the most dangerous chapter of all. Anger came later. At first, there was only clarity. Revenge would have been easy to imagine, loud, immediate, satisfying in the moment. But she understood something most people don't. Revenge burns fast and fades quickly. Truth, on the other hand, lingers. It asks questions. It forces explanations. And once released, it can't be locked away again. She didn't need to destroy them personally. She just needed the world to see what they had worked so hard to hide. She began reconstructing her lost time carefully, piece by piece. Dates anchored by seasons. Conversations tied to routines. Small details that seemed insignificant until they formed a pattern too precise to ignore. This wasn't emotional storytelling, it was documentation. And the more she organized her memories, the clearer it became that this wasn't an accident or misunderstanding. It was intent, sustained, coordinated. That distinction mattered. Because intent changes everything when truth finally meets scrutiny. When she spoke, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She let consistency do the work. Facts repeated without contradiction. Details that aligned too cleanly to be coincidence. The same calm patience that kept her alive now made her credible. And slowly, the narrative they had relied on began to fracture. Doubt crept in where certainty once lived. Questions replaced assumptions. And for the first time, the balance of power shifted completely out of their hands. This was the moment they feared most, not exposure, but inevitability. Because once truth enters the record, it doesn't matter how powerful you believe you are. Systems respond. People listen. Consequences begin moving whether you're ready or not. She didn't need to chase them. She didn't need to threaten. She only needed to stay steady and let the truth do what it always does in the end. It changes who is believed and who is finished. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It never does. First came the questions he couldn't answer without contradicting himself. Then the timelines that no longer lined up. Stories that once felt airtight began to leak. People who had trusted him started listening more closely to her. And every time the truth was repeated, calmly and consistently, it gained weight. Power slipped not through confrontation, but through exposure. The very control he relied on became evidence of his guilt. The mistress faded quickly when scrutiny arrived. Distance replaced confidence. Silence replaced certainty. Because manipulation thrives in secrecy, not daylight. And once the curtain was pulled back, her role became impossible to deny. The quiet suggestions, the reinforcing fear, the calculated detachment, all of it surfaced. What they believed was loyalty unraveled into self-preservation. When consequences appeared, unity vanished. That, more than anything, revealed the truth of their alliance. For him, ruin wasn't just legal or social, it was psychological. Control had defined him. Without it, he unraveled. Every attempt to explain only exposed more contradictions. Every effort to regain authority failed. The man who once decided everything now had no influence over how his story would be told. And that loss of narrative, of dominance, was the punishment he never anticipated. Because cages worked both ways. The one he built became the one he couldn't escape. As for her, survival became something larger. Not just endurance but meaning. She didn't reclaim the years that were stolen, but she reclaimed her voice. And sometimes, that's the most powerful form of justice there is. This story doesn't end with celebration. It ends with clarity. With a reminder that silence is often mistaken for weakness and patience for surrender. But when truth finally steps into the light, it has a way of destroying everything built to contain it.